Hello and welcome. And here I am, Nataliya Andreychuk, Chief Executive Officer of V7. And today's conversation is the one I have been looking forward for a while already. My guest today is Mark Watson from Fractal Force. Mark has spent decades working at the intersection of commercial strategy and execution in pharma, watching what works and what doesn't, and more importantly, why. But let us start this conversation not in the usual way. So let us start it with straightaway question. Like, Mark, before you tell us a little bit about yourself, please tell us what is the conversation you keep having with pharma commercial teams that made you think this podcast is worth recording?
Firstly, thank you for having me, Nataliya. Ultimately, I'm a pragmatist at heart, and what really drives me and what made me want to do this is helping people get past that theory versus practice hurdle, understanding what actually happens when the rubber hits the road. Because I keep seeing and hearing the same scenario time and time again. Companies have invested seriously, be that time, energy, money, all of the above, into omnichannel, but they still can't pinpoint what's working and what isn't. And in the worst case scenario, they can't actually even see that their engagement is improving at all. And that leads to the question that always comes my way. We've put in all the effort, so why aren't we seeing the results? And that's a conversation I think it's worth having today.
Excellent. So, it's very interesting angle. Tell us a little bit more about Fractal Force and how you are realizing all of these ideas over there.
So Fractal Force is an independent consulting company headed up by myself and my co-founder, Peter van der Becken. We started a few years ago, and we really put that element that I just mentioned at our heart. We're very much pragmatists, and we call ourselves the architects of customer engagement. We really want to understand what those foundational pillars are that drive forward customer engagement and customer centricity in a way that sees genuine results.
That's very interesting. I love the terminology architects of customer engagement. So customer engagement is a huge question. So we cannot move forward without like a little bit of assessment to get to the ground of things. So we all know that we have spent like decades to implement digital. We have been implementing all the technology, including CRM and different omnichannel technologies, huge amount of time, huge effort, and financially very, very much heavy. And yet, when we are talking today to clients, like we still have like people who are genuinely committed to this. So they do recognize there is still a gap between where they want to be and where they are today. Do you also see this gap?
Yeah. And that assessment is completely fair. It aligns with my opening statement. And I think anyone listening or watching this down the line will know exactly what you're describing, that they're probably living through it right now. And it's a really interesting question as to whether that gap exists. And to a certain extent, the reason it persists despite so much genuine effort being put in. My answer to that is pretty much always the same when I'm speaking to clients, former clients, friends and colleagues who are still in the industry. It's not a people problem. It's not even an investment or effort problem. It's often that architecture problem. The foundations that specifically HCP engagement was built upon were for a very different bygone era. Things were built for broadcasting. How can we get this message out to as many people as we possibly can in the most efficient and effective way? It wasn't really built around listening or responding, or indeed customer centricity, which is the buzzword of the moment, whether that's through omnichannel or opti-channel or inserts framework of your choice here. So no amount of new technology or new platforms is going to fix that underlying problem of, are we actually built to serve our customers in the way that they want to be engaged with?
It gives a lot of food for thought. So from do we measure the right things instead of measuring launching the new channel? Do we measure the customer engagement feedback? we are talking about customer centricity in pharma for years. So it was always, on the surface, we were always focused on these exact questions. So for you as the person who is always on the front line, right? So what has changed from the recent years and what hasn't changed? So do we have the very same reason why we are bringing back this very conversation about customer centricity?
And it's a very interesting question. And I think what has changed is probably the simpler one to answer because it's probably more universal. We have more data, we have more channels, we have more platforms, we have more technology. And depending on which company you work for, we have more money to do it with. What hasn't changed is what sits underneath it all. And that is speaking to our end users, be they patients, be they HCPs, be they governments, depending on which sort of divisions of pharma you live within, and understanding what they truly need, what they want to understand, and where we get that relevance for them. The CRMs that we're using still capture activity. We did this, we did that, this is when we did it, this is how often we did it. We're still not asking the question of, was it the right thing to do in the first place? Did it have any real impact? And when you build that forward to things like segmentation, they exist beautifully within a slide deck, within a sort of different framework that's been created, but no one's really understanding what does that mean in reality. HCP doesn't see themselves as persona X or persona Y. They have their own specific needs and questions, understandings and preferences. And when we look at things like planning cycles, which are still often annual, and if we're really lucky, maybe quarterly, the market, the needs, the interactions, they're fluid and they're dynamic and they're changing all the time. So what hasn't changed fundamentally is that despite all the investment, we are not up to speed and we're not utilizing the information that we have in a way that actually makes a difference to our end users. And those problems are fixable, but the reason they persist is that no one's going back to ask that fundamental question that you just asked. What is this whole system designed to do? And for most organizations, the honest answer right now is still, we're here to push messages. We're here to convince people that our brand is the best, the biggest, the loudest. And that doesn't make sense on an individual HCP basis.
In the other way, we are still shouting brands instead of telling a story, and we are still, very brand centric instead of persona centric. And I love that statement of yours where you say, right, we are speaking marketingly, say, with the persona, but this is not how the persona, exactly your opponent in the conversation, perceive themselves. So they think about their needs, so the personalization on the level of their needs and their interest, and this is not always the match. And this is very interesting because you say if you are the architect of the engagement, right? So let's try to answer this question. Why haven't we moved, right? So where specifically this architecture does break down? So if you go to commercial organization, to pharma commercial organization, what do you find?
And I think you hit the nail on the head there, Nataliya. It's very much that narrative. It's that story. It is a story. We are trying to tell the end user, in this case, often the HCP, why there's a value to using a specific medication or product or device in helping their patients. And that's the story we should be telling. But often the story we end up telling is ticking a box. And it goes back to what I was mentioning earlier. How do we start to leverage all of the new elements that have changed, the tech, the data, the content, etc., in a way that is meaningful to them? And that is the idea of customer centricity, right? It's supposed to be from their perspective, not ours, not I design a journey and push it through regardless. So when we look at the data that we have is often very brand centric, to your point. What did we do? What did we say? When did we do it? Did they attend? Did they not? How many patients do they have? It's very much from a commercial perspective, not an engagement perspective. And that flows through to the segmentation. Their persona X. Therefore, they must want to hear the story because we decided it. we don't ever verify whether we've actually put them on the right customer journey in the first place. And then when we start to talk about that journey logic, often again, it's another tick box exercise. We've bought new channels, we bought new content, so we must use them, we must push them. And on paper, they make sense. Here's an email, click on the email, we'll send you to a website, go to the website, download this, we'll then follow up with another email or invite you to a webinar. And on paper, it makes perfect sense. And for the 1% that do follow that journey, perfect. But for the other 99%, what do we do then? And this is where it all starts to break down. When our operating models are based on 1-year editorial plans, which we stick to rigidly and force people down a path. Mark is this and Nataliya is that, and therefore they will do their own things. What happens when that's not true? And where this starts to fall down is it becomes slightly self-perpetuating, because we're also measuring what shows us in the best light. Every division, every department, every brand head, etc. will have their KPIs. But if it's use the new channel, then tick, we did it. If it's get so many people to a congress, tick, we did it. But did it have any real impact? Was it meaningful? Did the HCPs like it? And because we don't measure that, we don't know. So we just end up in this cycle of doing the same thing again of, well, Nataliya didn't tell us that she wasn't a persona A, so we'll put her down the persona A rabbit hole again. And this is where it all starts to break down. People try and fix each one of these different pillars independently, but actually they're all very much intrinsically linked.
I think you are very right, because when we look at this from the other angle, also from the content angle, where we can see usually this is another stopper or another obstacle we have, because if we have for every, I would say, therapeutic area, we have more than 5 personas, and then we have localization, and then the volumes of the personalized content is unbearable from the production perspective, even with AI, from the perspective of managerial perspective, and financial burden is just unbelievable, right? And this also stops us significantly from solving these tasks. I think if we were somewhere in FMCG or the other industry where we do not have such strict medical regulatory approval process, so then these problems are better solvable than at our domain. So then we have to focus on that. So do you see these also as some of the challenges when you are working with the architecture of engagement?
Absolutely. And you raise some really interesting and valid points. I think to a certain extent, pharma trying to be like other industries is sometimes setting ourselves up to fail. But on the other hand, blaming everything on MLR is maybe a little bit lazy. And I'm not saying you're doing it. I hear it hundreds of times a year. The reality is that companies like yourselves and even when sort of pharma companies are trying to do this in-house, volume of content is no longer the issue. Between content factories and AI and different service provision, volume is never the issue. The issue is prioritization. We can only get so much through MLR. And therefore, what is genuinely going to make an impact? And this is where thinking about intelligent content design becomes very important. Who are we trying to speak to? Why are we trying to speak to them? What should we say to them? And this is where things like content tagging, segmentation orientation, strategic editorial calendars, where we know what is happening, when can we fit it into the right MLR sort of process window so that it gets improved on time when it's actually meaningful for the clients, or so that it hits just before a webinar or just after a congress. That strategic imperative needs to come first and foremost, rather than more is better, more is best, because we can always do more. But until we understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, then it starts to fall apart. So when the content cannot carry the strategy, which is what you alluded to in your question, it shows you that it's not the content itself that is the problem. It's a signal that certain other things haven't quite been fixed. And that's back to who are we talking to, why, what, and where. So it's definitely not a volume problem, that's for sure. And I think right now, faster is not always necessarily better. We always want faster, but I go back to that triangle, the iron triangle that's been around for forever, right? You can have it done better, cheaper, or quicker, but you can't have all three. Well, I would argue that you can if you're sensible about it.
You are bringing a great hope to all of us with your answer, I would say, because whenever I'm hitting any door, I still have this volume sound of the problem. So financially, managerially, so I do hear this very loud and clear. However, so I love the sound of it, the intelligence of content creation, right? This intelligence, this is the solution, because intelligence is an answer to fears. Because we have also a great deal of fear when, imagine we have this so much desirable, greatly working content machine, marketing machine, personalization machine, it's all working. And then we have this human factor where we say, we at risk making a grave mistake, pushing all that content around. Are we really at control of all of that, right? So that's where the problems start, because then the human intelligence starting to protect, and we are starting to over control the things and over engineer. So let us talk about what better actually looks like, not theoretically, concretely. So when HCP engagement is working in the way that it should, what difference do we bring?
So I've seen examples of this in sort of small little pockets. So I know it can work because I've seen it work. And it comes back to that fundamental piece of, if we're trying to improve customer engagement, it has to come from the customer first. But most importantly, going back to the beginning of this talk, it's about that rubber hitting the road. And that means the people who are actually going to voice the information to our customers, whether it's a rep or an MSL in person, whether it's a Congress speaker, whether it's the email that lands on their desk, it has to be done in a way that links back to that intelligent content piece. So when a rep or an MSL goes to begin that conversation, they have to have a genuine understanding of where that HCP is in their sort of patient diagnostic and treatment world, not just based on a persona, not just based on the brand plan for the year, but what have they actually engaged with? What do they actually think? What do they actually want? What is their starting point from an attitudinal and a behavioral perspective, so that the conversation can start somewhere useful and meaningful to the HCP, rather than just starting from zero every time, or simply based on a sort of algorithmic, it's week 6, so therefore it has to be message 4. From a HCP's perspective, this is massive. It means that the relationship and the trust is better embedded. They're more likely to engage, they're more likely to follow up, they're more likely to ask questions, and they're more likely to come back again, because then it begins to be a real conversation. And this has often been lauded for sort of the 15 odd years I've been doing this in pharma as digital can't have a conversation. Well, no, an email is never going to sort of start talking to you. But if it's built in a way where the content makes sense and the journey makes sense, and it's being sent because you asked for it, or it fits nicely into the sort of conversation you did just have, or the webinar you did just attend, or based on the question you asked at a Congress, now it's part of that conversation. And this is that feedback loop in terms of engage, observe what happened, learn what went well, adapt, and start again. If you can create that content, that is what good looks like. So the content has to be there in the factory, but when it's sent, how it's sent, and who it's sent to, that cycle of genuine, true engagement and conversation, and building that narrative, as you called it earlier, that's where we start to win.
This feedback loop is exactly what we need to really try to build, right? So it distinguishes us significantly from being, shouting about the brands and value, to having actually this conversation and having the dialogue, right? And It's worth naming what that actually requires practically. So, because this is where the thinking meets the doing. So, what is your take here?
100%. And the reality is, whilst I can work this on a piece of paper and the theory, the reality of this, where systems make things easier, platforms make things easier, that's definitely your territory. And it's the part that makes the difference between, again, an idea on paper, which I can come up with, and the reality of what works in the field and what you're helping your customers achieve.
That's amazing. So it means like even within all these technical advantages, we have a lot of things to do. So let us focus on the next big question we have. How do we make it real, right? So how do we make it real? Let me bring it to the very practical dimension. The picture Mark you just described, the feedback loop, the intelligent content, this all logical and coherent journey, this requires actual infrastructure to run. Content that is modular and properly tagged, so the orchestration that is connected to the journey logic rather than just, firing and launching the channels independently, data that flows to tell you what is happening. This is what we help our clients to build, and the reason it matters is exactly what you just articulated. But how do you make it real so that customers trust this is real, this works?
I think that the biggest issue that I continue to see is understanding that the order really matters. So the journey logic has to exist before you start building the content. And by that, I mean, we need to understand that narrative. What are we trying to explain? What is the story we're trying to tell? And then how does that break up into pieces that naturally create a conversation and flow across, whether it's different channels or different timelines or different content pieces in different ways to different segments. But this is all, and this is the scary part, it is all theoretical. It's what we as scientists do best, right? There's a null hypothesis, we test it, and when it works, great, and when it doesn't, we need to fix that. So the measurement framework also has to be designed and deployed before we start to sort of push things out and before we start to tag things. Because what are we really trying to do with that email? What are we really trying to do with that page within the CLM? Why are we inviting people to that webinar? So when we start to sort of create this framework of what's the narrative and what are we trying to achieve, it's then much easier to sort of then fit the content in and go, well, if we're trying to achieve a callback, then it has to have a really good call to action. If we're trying to achieve sharing, then it has to be printable, etc., etc. And that sort of understanding the flow of things is where it gets really not impossible, but tricky. We have to think. We can't just, as you say, we can't just launch and hope. We need to understand what we think is going to happen and then measure whether it really does. Because what you're describing in reality is that execution letter. It's what turns a good idea into a program that actually runs. And as we sort of started off, it's when the rubber hits the road. Are we actually going to see that acceleration and the movement in the right direction?
That's really amazing. I love this statement of yours. We cannot launch and hope. This is not exactly what we will do, right? So that's why for everyone who is listening us, there are surely people who recognize the problems we are highlighting here. So the gaps, the missing feedback loop. So there are people who are in the middle of transformation and they already committed to platforms and the processes. What would be your recommendation to them? Where do they start? What would be the best, most honest advice from your side?
I think going back to my very first element, pragmatism, before you add anything, whether it's another channel, another service, another bit of content, before you add anything or pay for anything else, just pause. And I know that's the hardest thing to do. We often talk about in Pharma about fixing the wings whilst we're already flying. So pressing pause seems very dangerous, but just pause and take a breath and really define what does working actually look like. Not at the activity level, not in terms of volume, not in terms of ticking a box, but at a genuine behavioral level. What are we trying to get our HCPs to do differently, to think differently, or to believe, what would genuine success look like from a communication and an engagement perspective? Not sales, not activity, but from a genuine engagement perspective. And when you start to be able to answer that, then I think the rest of it falls into place. But if you can't, then it asks a bigger question. If you don't know what you're really trying to achieve, what is launching a new channel or a new bit of content actually going to do for you?
Fixing your wings before you try to fly, right? So
It's
you
the
need to
ideal, right? It's the ideal.
understand. Yeah, you need to understand what you are doing, where you are going, then you will arrive at your destination. That's absolutely right. Thank you, Mark. So now we are at my very favorite section, which requires a short answers from your side. Hot or not means if you agree, this is the statement you would support, you say hot. If it is something sitting not very good with you, you say not. So, and we have a couple of statements. So let us go there. Are you ready? You ready to give your verdict?
I'll do my best.
Good. So here we are. Let's go for that. Omnichannel is still mainly a technology problem.
100% no. The tech works, some better than others. This is a logic problem and an integration problem.
The next one. AI is going to transform HCP engagement in the next 3 years.
Depending on how you read the question in your mind, I would say no. It will accelerate things for sure in terms of tools and timing. The engagement still has to be the same. What do they want? Give it to them.
What do they want? What do they need? So that's right. The next one. Most pharma companies don't actually know which of their HCP engagement is working.
Sadly, I would have to agree. Activity, what hits the right numbers, what ticks the right boxes for sure. But what does it actually really mean in real life to individual HCPs? I think this is a huge blind spot right now.
So true. The next one is the trickiest one. The biggest barrier to better engagement is internal politics, not capability.
I would agree. I think obviously on an individual level, capacity and capability differs company to company, but for the most part, I think the investment is there. The people are willing. There is a will. I think it's the bigger infrastructure, things like the annual cycle plans, the lack of flexibility around KPIs. It's having that ability to change, not the capacity to do it.
Unfortunately. So there is the other one which we have just tackled briefly, the favorite one of the MLR on the scene. Pharma will never be truly customer centric because of the regulation.
Again, I'm going to say no. I'm going to be very optimistic here. Especially, I've worked in medical agencies, so especially when you're with an MSL and you're having an open and honest conversation with HCPs, you can literally say almost anything you want within some kind of confines. Obviously, the regulations from promotional materials is much more stringent, but it doesn't mean we can't tell the HCPs the bit of information that is most useful to them. And that's customer centricity, not necessarily open freedom on what we say.
Yeah, I love the optimism. I definitely in that zone as well. So let's hope. The last but not least, very interesting one. Less content, better targeted, would outperform more content broadly distributed.
100%. It is a huge risk, and I understand why companies aren't willing to take that risk, because for hundreds of years we've been in broadcast mode. If I send it to 1,000 people and 100 people turn up, then I've done a good job. I would argue, and I have done it with clients, and I have proved it when I have been an omnichannel manager myself. If you invite the right 100 people, the right 100 people will turn up regardless of whether you invited 1,000 or 10,000. So I would strongly implore, at first, a hybrid approach to make things a little bit more palatable, but more precise, targeted will always have greater impact.
That's an interesting one. I want to close it with the question to you. So the last question, but very important one. Imagine so that many commercial leaders, I hope here, are listening to us, right? And if you would have a chance to ask one question this week to them. So what it will be?
I think from a consulting perspective, we always talk about Pareto efficiencies and the 80-20 rule. And I think it's probably hugely important on the conversation we just had. The top 20% of your audience are the most important. And it would be overly optimistic of me to say for all your audience. So let's just concentrate on the top 20%. For that top 20%, can you genuinely tell yourself, hand on heart, from actual data, not just gut feel, not just what the sales director said, not from marketing, but with data, whether that top 20% are more engaged and have improved their behavior in a direction that you want them to versus the last quarter, the last cycle, the last year? And if you are, great. Keep doing it, you're ahead of the curve. But if the answer's no, then you really need to start to look at, are we just doing stuff for the sake of doing stuff? Or is there a genuine strategy to how my content is going out into the universe to create a narrative that puts a positive spin on my product, my medication, etc., that is genuinely going to improve patient outcomes?
Mark, it's beautiful. Thank you. It was like very honest, very transparent, and very practical conversation. So I really thank you for your time. And you have named a lot to take for our audience about the gaps, about the feedback loops, about the frustration, intelligent content, about how proactive we must be, about the engagement, the architecture of it. That's really, really interesting insight. For our listeners, we are not saying farewell at this note. We do have a short survey. You will find it in the show notes. There are just 4 questions. 2 minutes of your time. Your answers will genuinely shape where this conversation will go next, and also will help you to understand where you are in this omnichannel journey. And for listeners who will be next week, the 20th of April in Barcelona at Reuters event, please find us. We are there. Talk to us. Let us have a conversation. Until next time, stay honest about the gaps, the blockers. Be true to yourself. Build the architecture of communication and engagement. Mark, thanks again. And goodbye to everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye to all.